Hi everyone, tonight's video is on trophic levels, food chains, and food webs. So what is a food chain? A food chain is a pattern of feeding relationships. What's a trophic level? Well, it's just a step in the food chain. So let's look at this fairly simplistic food chain. It starts with some plants down here at the bottom, and then we have some insects, a frog, a snake, and a hawk. The bottom of a food chain is always our plants. Plants are producers. What do they produce? They produce oxygen by photosynthesis, and they produce organic carbon also by photosynthesis. As we'll talk about soon when we talk about ecological cycles, plants are also responsible for bringing nitrogen and phosphorus into the food chain. Producers or plants are autotrophs because they make their own food. The next step up in a food chain is the primary consumer. Primary consumers eat the producers. Because they eat producers, they have to eat their food, they are heterotrophs. So our primary consumer eats the producer. They are herbivores because producers are plants. The secondary consumer eats the primary consumer. And because it has to eat, it is a heterotroph, it cannot make its own food. And because it's eating the primary consumer, it is a carnivore. The tertiary consumer eats the secondary consumer, and again, because it has to eat, it cannot make its own food, it is a heterotroph. And again, because it's eating an animal, it is a carnivore. The highest step in this food chain is a quaternary consumer. It eats the tertiary consumer, and it is again a heterotroph because it cannot make its own food, and it is a carnivore because it is eating animals. What happens when all of these animals die? Well, they are broken down by fungi, bacteria, and insects, which are together called the detritivores or decomposers. They break down the dead organisms into the macromolecules and then the small components of the macromolecules, and then the even smaller components of the monomers of those macromolecules, and those are brought back into the food chain by our plants, by our producers. In an ecosystem, food chains are actually interwoven to form food webs. They aren't as simplistic as I showed you in the last slide. What you can see here is a little bit more realistic in the form of a food web. So the green at the bottom, all of those organisms highlighted green, are our producers. They are again photosynthetic, so they are autotrophs. The next layer up in a food web is the primary consumers. The primary consumers eat the producers, so they are herbivores, and they are all highlighted pink. So we have the grasshopper, the butterfly, and the fly. Highlighted in kind of a purple are our secondary consumers. The secondary consumers eat the primary consumers. So the bird eats the fly, the frog eats the grasshopper, etc. It gets a little more confusing with the tertiary consumers because as you can see, both the bird and the frog are both secondary consumers and tertiary consumers. If we look at the bird, it's a secondary consumer because it eats the fly, but it's a tertiary consumer because it can eat the dragonfly, which can also eat the fly. The same with the frog. It's a secondary consumer because it can consume the grasshopper, but it's a tertiary consumer because it can also consume the dragonfly. We have some other tertiary consumers in this food web that are playing only the role of tertiary consumers. So that's our wolf, which is eating the mouse, and the snake, which can also eat the mouse. The golden eagle here, or the bald eagle, can play the role of tertiary consumer because it can eat the mouse also. But my bald eagle could play the role of a quaternary consumer when it is eating the snake, which is a tertiary consumer. So in a food web, what you see is that certain organisms can play multiple roles. Note the way that this food web is organized. The species are arranged into trophic levels as much as possible. Our species that play multiple roles could be lower or higher in the food web, but as much as possible, we try to arrange these webs in layers that correspond to their trophic levels. The next thing to note is that the arrows always go up in a food web. This is something students often mistake. The arrows go up because what the arrow is indicating is the energy flow in a food web, that the energy is going from the producers to the primary consumers, to the secondary consumers, to the tertiary consumers, to the quaternary consumers. Students often reverse the arrows because they like it to reflect the feeding relationship, when in fact it should reflect the energy transfer. So where does the energy in a food web come from to start? Well, the energy on the Earth, all the energy on Earth, originally comes from the sun in the form of light energy. It's transformed by the producers into chemical energy by the process of photosynthesis. All the energy in a food web comes from the producers via the sun, and the producers set the energy available for the entire ecosystem. So let's look at this. Again, all of the energy on Earth comes from the sun. What percent of the energy that is made by producers gets moved up in each step in the food web? Let's look at this. If we say that the sun starts out with 100,000 units, or this is 10,000 units of energy, just a generic unit. The primary producers are able to take approximately 1% of that energy and transform it into chemical energy. So that means the primary producers would have 100 units of energy if the sun started with 10,000 units of energy. The primary consumers then are only able to get 10% of the energy from the primary producers. That means my primary consumer would have 10 units of energy. Even though the sun started with 10,000, 1,000 of that was able to be transformed into chemical energy by the primary producers, and then only 10% of that was able to be transformed into more chemical energy by the primary consumers. So we're down to 10 units of energy. The secondary consumers, again, can only transform 10% of the energy from the primary consumers, meaning that the secondary consumers only have 1 unit of energy. Keep going up the food chain, and what we see is that only 10% of the energy from the secondary consumers can be transformed into energy by the third level consumers, and that becomes 0.1 units of energy. Going up to the quaternary level, again, only 10% of the energy can be transformed into chemical energy. So starting with 10,000 units of energy from the sun, by the time you get to a quaternary consumer, you have 0.01 units of energy left. We refer to this as the 10% rule. But students often make mistakes when calculating the amount of energy in a level of consumer when given a certain amount of energy in the sun, because they forget that the first step, the step that the primary producers are able to transform from solar energy into chemical energy, is only 1%. So we refer to this as the 10% rule, but you always have to remember that the original energy from the sun, only 1% of that is transformed into chemical energy by the primary producers. So after watching this video, you should be able to identify the trophic levels and place organisms at the correct trophic level in a food chain and a food web. You should be able to label organisms in a food web or a food chain as autotrophs or heterotrophs, and as herbivores or carnivores. You should also be able to use the 10% rule to calculate the amount of energy in any trophic level if given the starting amount of energy either in the sun or in a different trophic level. So that's all for tonight.